Welcome back to Cultivate Talk, the podcast where we explore the role communication plays in our relationships, workplaces, communities, and everyday lives. Today, I'm joined by Dr. David Beard, professor of rhetoric at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Dr. Beard's work is remarkably interdisciplinary, bringing his expertise as a rhetorician into conversations surrounding healthcare, rural communities, transportation, environmental issues, and more. As he puts it, he joins the communities where he feels his skills as a rhetorician can make a difference. And that idea really sits at the heart of our conversation today. What can rhetoric actually do? We talk about rhetoric not simply as persuasion, but as a way of identifying problems, helping others understand why those problems matter, and bringing people with very different expertise together to imagine solutions. We also discuss environmental grief, interdisciplinary collaboration, research funding, and why communication needs to be part of problem solving from the very beginning, not something we add at the end. Here's my conversation with Dr. David Beard. Well, thank you so much for joining me today on an episode of Cultivate Talk, David. How are you doing and how is your summer going?
I mean, it's a warm summer day for Duluth, Minnesota. By warm, that means it's about 68. We're cooled by Lake Superior. And so summer is always a little more relaxed here on the North Shore. And I hope I am too.
Yeah, no, that is amazing. As someone who absolutely hates the heat, and I consider myself to be quite a wimp when it comes to the heat, I love the 60s. So that sounds, especially in the summer, that sounds pretty amazing to me, and I love that. And I'm super excited to be able to connect with you today about your wonderful work and to kind of kick things off. I wanted to get started with our first question. So you describe rhetoric as the ability to formulate a problem and make that problem salient to others. That's a different definition than many people have in mind. How do you define rhetoric and why do you think it's so often misunderstood?
I mean, I feel like there is a traditional source for that way of understanding rhetoric. When I was an undergraduate, I really fell hard for I.A. Richards' definition of rhetoric, which is the study of miscommunication and its remedies, right?
Right.
And I feel like beginning with the problem is intrinsic to that understanding of rhetoric. And honestly, when I was an undergraduate, I was a first-generation undergraduate, only the sixth person in my family to make it out of middle school. I got to college and I misunderstood everything all over the place. And so the notion that I could participate in a discipline that focused on misunderstanding and helping heal or remedy that misunderstanding was very attractive to me. I also think that the notion of the relationship between rhetoric and problem, we get a little bit of that in the bits or vats discussions, right? The discussions about the rhetorical situation that were so dynamic in the field in the last quarter of the last century. Trying to figure out, does the situation call forth the rhetoric, or does the rhetorician frame the situation? That's kind of the way that exchange went back and forth for a number of years. I guess rather than wondering whether the problem calls forth the rhetoric or whether the rhetorician makes the problem manifest in their language, I just figured there's a problem to solve, and I can roll up my sleeves and I can get to it. And I guess that's what I tried to do.
Yeah, I love that explanation. That is amazing. Thank you. I find myself personally, like rhetoric has never been my research focus and has never really been my background in this discipline, but I have had the pleasure of teaching a couple of courses focused on it. And I absolutely love picking the brains of rhetoricians, I think, because it is something that feels incredibly dynamic to me. And it's something that's so fascinating because it is something that I'm not often immersing myself in. So, like I said, I'm super excited that you're here today and super excited to talk and kind of unpack this a little bit more. So your work frequently brings you into interdisciplinary teams tackling issues like healthcare, transportation, and environmental challenges. What role does a communication scholar play when people from very different disciplines are trying to solve the same problem?
I mean, I think the first skill set I learned when I was a student was the subset of rhetoric called the rhetoric of inquiry, which is basically learning that discipline's frame and try to solve problems with their own languages and their own approaches. And my job becomes, in many ways, trying to help them translate, talking across and with each other, helping a social scientist understand that a problem they think can be best measured through a survey can also be addressed through a painting, right?
Right.
That climate change can be addressed through political advocacy, for sure, but it can also be addressed by a string quartet. And that a rural, in the case of the Rural Medicine Project, rural medical workplace shortages, the stressors that affect people who work in small critical access hospitals, can be addressed not by making any changes at all within the hospital, but instead by asking the city and county governments to revise their housing policies, right? It's my job as a rhetorician to help these different professions and disciplines figure out how they can mutually address and maybe also respect the way that each other can address the problems. The other skill set that I think I learned that I'm pretty appreciative of, when I was an assistant professor, I had a accidental acquaintance with another faculty member who went through the same campus I went through on the University of Minnesota system, the St. Paul campus. And he mistakenly thought we had overlapping professors. And at a certain point, he reached out to me thinking, again, that we had this common intellectual heritage, basically not realizing I was a rhetorician instead of a social scientist. And he said to me, "Would you like to become involved in the International Listening Association?" And I did. And for a number of years, I edited the International Journal of Listening and learned so much about the disciplinary literature on listening. And that really also guides and has inflected my practices as a rhetorician, because you can't understand a problem unless you know how and who to listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. Listening, I feel like, is one of those underrated elements of communication that people assume they're super great at, or they assume that it's just common sense and that people know that it's important until we actually begin unpacking and practicing it. And then we realize, like, oh, this is actually way more important than we gave it credit for, or way more important than we ever put time and energy into and talk about. And it absolutely can make or break communication. So I love that.
I used to go to steampunk conventions and
Yeah.
give talks about Victorian strategies for listening. There were all sorts of very, very weird devices before we had hearing aids that
Yeah.
the Victorians would use to better communicate and be able to physically hear each other listening, right?
Yes.
But it was also a sneaky way to hand out a 20-question survey about your listening preferences. And then at the end of that discussion, talk to the nerds about, well, how do you listen, right? What are your natural predilections or tendencies in the listening process? And it was always interesting to me, the people who would hang around afterwards and come and express to me that now they understood why they fought with their mom so much, for example. So I think once you make people aware of listening as not just a thing that happens, but as a set of behaviors that you can modulate, control, vary, it opens up whole new fields of power and agency in your ability to relate to other human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. So, to kind of segue, you've worked on projects ranging from rural hospital burnout to environmental grief. What do these seemingly different issues have in common from a communication perspective?
I tell you, this is hard for me to think about because, like, if you were to say, let's have an annual meeting of the NCA, and how would David frame a panel where each of these projects would talk to each other, I'd have a hard time. But I'd have a hard time because I think I'm trying to make an argument about the origins of our communicative differences. I think the communication studies literature is exceptionally good at figuring out, like, when we're in an information bubble and how the information bubble can affect our ideological approaches to communication, our ideological assumptions as we talk with other people. But I also really believe that some of our communication struggles are rooted in real, concrete, material parts of our lives. And so one of the examples I like to give about this, when we think about environment and health and the material circumstances of life, one of the small rural communities I work with has a population of 1,800 people. They are sandwiched on one side by a decommissioned radar base that the Air Force abandoned in 1980 and stuck a chain link fence around because it's a brownfield site. The contaminants that the military left behind have made the well water in that portion of the town undrinkable. On the other side of town, there is a mining facility which works with the preparation and shipping of taconite pellets from Minnesota's Iron Range. And there are some active brownfields in that facility and around it. And so literally on both sides of the town there are contaminants, pollutions. And once a year maybe they'll receive a drinking alert which says that the groundwater for the town is undrinkable for the next few days. Because something has happened, the way the waters flow within the region directs some of the pollutions into the common water table. And when I talk to these folks and they express to me a skepticism of the usefulness or the power of government, or a skepticism about whether government is part of the solution or part of the problem, right? Sure, some of that comes from the information bubble that they live in. It comes from the ideologies that they have consumed. But some of it also, frankly, I think has to come from the material circumstances in which they live. I think a lot of how we communicate, the strategies we communicate with each other, the values that drive our communication aren't just reducible to ideological commitments, but are also about what are the material resources, what are the political resources, what are the social resources that we have access to, that we're denied, or that we struggle perhaps harder than some others to have access to. And so as I think about talking about climate change, about rural health, about rural transportation systems, what I'm really also trying to get at is an explanation of how these material conditions change or impact how they communicate, people in those communities communicate with each other, and how they participate then in our broader democracy. Does that kind of make sense?
Absolutely. No, that is an amazing articulation. Thank you. That absolutely makes sense. So, kind of tagging on that, and I'm going a little out of order from what I had originally planned, but so this concept, this environmental grief is like a fascinating concept. I really kind of like this phrasing. Can you unpack that and kind of explain what it is and how communication influences whether those feelings lead people toward action or toward hopelessness and that political disengagement?
So environmental grief is so interesting to me because it's one of those things you can very consciously experience as part of climate change, right? You can be aware that climate change is happening, understand its inevitable consequences for your own life and for your children's lives. And then as you feel it happening, you experience grief. Josh Barnett taught at the University of Minnesota Duluth for a while, and he's written very well about some of these kinds of very extensive emotional responses to the inevitability, or at least the inexorable march towards climate change. There are also people who experience climate grief, and they don't necessarily have that immediate connection to climate change. They know that the birds are migrating differently. They know that the seasons under which they might engage in outdoor sports are changing, shortening, right? In many cases, especially here for winter sports. They know that something about the world is changing, and it's making them uncomfortable, but maybe they haven't quite yet bought into the ideology that says, and therefore we should cap carbon emissions, right?
Right.
And so I think that I feel two ways about this. The first is, hey, the first thing we need to do is acknowledge whatever feelings people have, right? If you have that sense of climate grief that comes from the profound awareness of climate change, acknowledge it. and work with people. This is the easy move, right? Work with these people to move out of the sadness into the action, right? For people who may have a more diffuse sense of the cause, who know that something is changing, who they aren't comfortable with the change, they may even be grieving the change, even if they aren't really there yet to accept the cause for the change as we understand it. It's important to recognize where they are, right? And to recognize forgive me for just a second there.
No, that's good.
As I was reading a portion of your research, Emily, it became so clear to me that if you're going to support someone through a tough time, right, you need to acknowledge the experiences that they're having first. Does that sound like a reasonable paraphrase?
Yes, it does.
And I think if we're going to invite someone into the political processes that can bring about change, then we start by acknowledging whatever their current emotional life is, right? And maybe that emotional life is the snowmobile season just seems to be getting shorter and shorter. And if the snowmobile season is getting shorter and shorter, my family's income may be shrinking more and more if I depend on that economically. That's awful. That's awful. Let's recognize how awful that is first, and then let's talk about what can we do, right?
Right.
Does that kind of make sense?
No, it totally makes sense. Absolutely. So that mindful communication is definitely important through recognition and then support.
And it's not going to be easy, right? I mean, again, and when we think about people, especially those who live geographically remote from what we think of as the centers of power in a state, if you live 300 miles away from the state capital in a place where your well water and your septic are your own responsibility, and when the power goes out, it doesn't go out for an hour or two the way it does in a city. It goes out for a week, right? You're not used to thinking about your vote having a determinative shape, a determinative force on your future, right? Political action is not where you think the solutions to your problems are.
Yeah.
And inviting them into those discussions about the solutions means starting with that recognition too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's awesome. Well, awesome how you explained it, I should say.
Yeah, yeah.
So you also work with funders who decide which projects receive support. How does effective communication shape not only public understanding, but also whether important research and community initiatives actually get funded?
The number one problem, I've spent some time working to prepare science students working on their NSF graduate research proposals. I've also served as a reader for the State Arts Board, for the regional arts councils in my area. I've also served as a reader for the Canadian Shirk grants. I read all sorts of grants, right? You learn how grants operate by writing them a little bit, but by serving on review panels a lot. I offer that as a way to say I think I can speak broadly, right?
Yes, absolutely.
People think that funding for a project is based on the quality of the project. I have such a great project. I have produced such a quality proposal. It must surely be fundable. And in fact, that's like the bare minimum, right? Anybody who's reasonably competitive will have a quality project with a quality proposal. There's a beautiful line by Captain Picard from Star Trek. It is possible to commit no errors and still lose, right?
Yeah.
It's possible to write a funding proposal which commits no errors and still not be funded, right?
Right.
What is the secret sauce that I would offer to someone who wants to see their research program funded by an external funder, who wants to see their research program gain traction in the public arena, perhaps by connecting to some external funding? It's to match the deliverables and the goals of your project to the values and the mission of the funder, right?
Yeah.
It's a matching, it's a pairing of those things. The best deliverables achieving the highest goals that don't match the values and priorities of the funder won't matter, right? And if it's a government funder, I often remind folks that fundamentally someone in government has decided that you are a more efficient way, you as the applicant, the grant writer, are the more efficient way to achieve the government's goals than a new government agency or hiring more people into long-term government programs. That there's something more efficient about giving you this money than just allocating it within a state agency. And as you're framing what you want to do, that's the argument you're wanting to make, right? That if you hand me this money, I will achieve your goals in addition to achieving whatever my own are. Similarly, if you're looking at research funding, I think that, let me think for a second here. A research fellowship is not just about seeding the creation of high-quality research. Inevitably, the program which creates it has goals beyond that, intrinsic to it. It may be creating seed opportunities so that you can seek larger funding. And by gum, if you have the most beautiful project that doesn't seem like it's likely to be funded anywhere else, you don't make a good argument as a seed grant. If the goal is intrinsically to prepare for interdisciplinary research, not just because interdisciplinary is a good thing, but because interdisciplinary helps ramp up the capacity of the organization to seek funding from larger, more lucrative funding sources. Make sure your proposal argues that you can do that too, right?
Yeah.
Some research funding basically boils down to the wishes of a very rich initial person, right? Someone who endows a program, who really feels like supporting. I've literally helped people write grants which are targeted towards supporting the K-12 educational needs of people who live in a specific zip code on the Iron Range, right?
Right.
And there's part of you that feels like, well, that seems oddly specific. Fundamentally, I think a lot of grant writing could be usefully thought of with that same lens, right? That fundamentally there was a funder who was probably from that zip code who really had a hard time struggling with his family meeting his own needs as a K-12 student, and now wants to leave a legacy which makes it easier for future generations to come up. Your goal is to show that your actions meet that funder's goals, right?
Yeah.
I think most grant writing would benefit from that kind of perspective. Does that work?
Absolutely, that works. And that really makes sense. And I think that's such an important distinction and such an important way to think about funding in general, because it's not just with, government related projects or kind of thinking on like the bigger picture in that regard. We see it in so many different industries and in so many different fields, and kind of what you were alluding to, like even in academia. So I think that is such an important distinction and a really important perspective of like thinking about it to kind of keep in mind it, no matter what field a person is in.
Well, I'm now going to try to learn from you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You work as a consultant, yeah?
Yes.
I presume nobody hires a consultant because they want the consultant to come in and say everything is terrible.
Right.
Right?
That would not be very healthy, yeah.
So there must be a similar kind of match in the consulting process, maybe?
There's a similar match. It's being able to recognize goals. So it's not necessarily always framed of like this particular company or organization has this problem they need to they need to work on, or are dealing with. It's definitely like, okay, maybe we have these patterns, maybe we have these points of tension, but our overall goal is to create an environment of psychological safety, or it is to be better public speakers so that we can connect with our clients more and, achieve those professional goals that we have. Or perhaps it is to just become a more compassionate environment because we've been dealing with workplace conflict and tension. And so those goals, it's really important for like me and the person I'm working with or the organization I'm working with to recognize and first, kind of like what we were talking about with support, like acknowledge those goals. Like, okay, this is what we want to happen. So that helps us, and that our cohesion of working together is well communicated and it's well matched in terms of values and what I bring to the table and how I can benefit the overall situation, while keeping their goal in mind.
I think that's number one, very useful. Thank you for sharing that with me, because
Yeah, yeah.
every once in a while I think, should I try the consulting gig? And so learning from you has been helpful as I think through that kind of thing myself. But above and beyond whether that's helpful to me, it really reaffirms what I think is powerful about being a communication scholar, right? That we understand the processes that create the collaborative environments that allow a funder and a grantee to work together, or a consultant and a hiring corporation to work together. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. So you've alluded to this a few times in our conversation so far, but we keep coming back to this idea of like interdisciplinary studies and interdisciplinary work. And interdisciplinary collaboration sounds ideal in theory, but it can be difficult in practice because every field has its own language and priorities. I
Mm-hmm.
think you and I have touched base on this in, one-on-one conversations we have had as well as this interview. But what communication practices help people bridge those differences and work together effectively?
Um, so it's a little out of favor right now. But one of my favorite heuristics is the listening styles and preferences profile, LSPP.
Yeah.
And it's been revised a number of times. It's up to like version 16, 18, something like that, a very high number. And so it's changed a bit from the version I'm going to talk with you, because the version I'm going to talk about with you is so easy to remember, right? You can cut that part out, right? So I really fell hard for the study of listening styles and listening preferences as a way to be a first step for this, because there's a whole body of literature which talks about some people, by tendency, by personality type, tend to listen with an aim toward action, right? I listen to you so that I can decide how I'm going to do something, or what I'm going to say when you're done talking. And there are a whole bunch of human beings who primarily listen with what was called the time orientation, right? And the goal is, how can we move this exchange through more efficiently so that I can get on with whatever my real work for the day is. These are both very unhelpful listening strategies for the kind of work we're talking about, interdisciplinary work. Without a doubt, you have to reach those stages at some point, but they're not the first foot you put forward. The first foot you put forward is the listening with attention to relationships and listening with attention towards the content, right? The listening styles that I think you soak in those in a collaborative exchange first. You let yourself be immersed so that you can understand that what one person calls burnout, another person calls churn, because one is focusing on the implications for the individual, and the other is describing the implications for the institution, right?
Right. Yeah.
And until you kind of realize, oh, they're kind of using the same word to talk about, or different words to talk about the same thing, and that becomes a moment to reach across some disciplinary and professional divides. But it takes a while to listen to content, and then to listen to relationships, so that people feel okay. I don't know. I hate to phrase it this way. Wasting their time explaining stuff that they learned as a second year undergraduate, right? Those
Yeah.
core disciplinary differences that, you spend a great deal of time, especially if you're learning the social scientific edge of things, figuring out how to measure something. And if you are a rhetorician, you never measure anything at all. Rhetoric is interested in flashes of insight and critical reframing much more than it is in measurement. And so to listen long enough and attentively enough to pick up on, when you're working with an organizational psychology person, what do they mean when they say leadership? In fact, they have a definition of leadership which is not really defined by the words that they're using, but instead by the instruments that they're using to measure it with. Does that kind of make sense?
Absolutely. No, that's great.
So learning to listen and talk across those things is very helpful. Would you call yourself an interpersonal communication scholar? Is that
What? Yes.
social scientific?
Yeah.
Um, I wish there were a better way for me to ask this question. So edit this out as you would want or need to. Okay. Um, like, I feel like your work would have had bigger, hotter pickup if you were in, I don't know, a Brene Brown social worky kind of
Yeah.
context rather than a communication context.
Right. No, you're totally right.
Can you talk to me a little bit about, or can we talk with each other a little bit about the way you would position the insights of communication and maybe the challenges in getting pickup when you're speaking from communication to a problem that other disciplines have kind of called their own? Does that make sense?
It kind of makes sense. Yeah, I think I'm following you. So you mean like with other disciplines and in other fields?
Well, I do not want to depict you as struggling if you don't see yourself as struggling, but I read your dissertation enough to go this is useful, this is helpful, this should be in the hands of therapists potentially,
Yeah.
MSWs with LICSW certification so they can be therapists,
Right.
right? But what keeps it out of their hands,
Yeah, so that's kind of like where the health communication angle comes in as well. So I do interpersonal and health. And health is really just because of that support and like kind of what you were saying, like that therapist standpoint, mental
Mhm.
health workers, people who actually need it. And that was part of the reason I started the consulting business was so that I could work one on one with those fields
Mhm.
because I believe so strongly in, this research and in this work. And I don't naturally cross paths with many people like that. At my university, I have the pleasure of teaching a lot of those that are on like the nursing track, but not necessarily like the psychology therapist track. So you're absolutely right from like a Brene Brown standpoint. That kind of accessibility would be something that would benefit those in fields beyond communication.
So would you say that your strategy for reaching the audiences who need your work is to do it through, how did you describe it, teaching without the grading, the consulting work?
Yeah, the consulting work. Yeah, it's like teaching without grading is being able to go into these spaces and teach and talk about this work while obviously not being tied to anything academic related, but being able to kind of share this work and talk about it in spaces that can make it hands-on and like actually put it to practice immediately.
Um, when you get how many subscribers do you have on YouTube?
I wish I could tell you. I don't even know.
Well,
Probably like 30, I think.
okay. Well, when you get to whatever it is, you know how they do special things for. We have 1,000 subscribers. We're going to
Yeah.
do a special thing.
Yeah.
Uh, when you get to 1,000 subscribers, you poke me, and I would like to interview you about how your work can reach further in the way that you're kind enough to interview other people in this way.
That's a good idea. Thank you, David.
Because, yeah, I read it and I'm like, it would be nice if people outside the geographic range where you can be a consultant could have access to some of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Okay, so to get back on track, I'm going to wrap up with our final question, just because you've done a really good job in your explanations of kind of like pairing together ideas. So I'm trying not to make things redundant. But so yeah, I'm just going to lead with that. If listeners could take away one lesson from rhetoric that would help them become better problem solvers in their workplaces, communities, or everyday lives, what would you want that lesson to be?
So I'm going to presume that there are two kinds of people listening. And one is the junior academic, right?
Right.
Someone who is hopeful to find a spot for themselves in their work within the life of the university. And there's a beautiful bit in rhetorical studies called the trained incapacity. It's a line from Kenneth Burke, who was one of the rhetoricians everybody reads. He has his own scholarly society. They hang out with each other. They go visit his birthplace. They're Kenneth Burke nerds. Very cool, and Kenneth Burke is pretty cool too. But when Kenneth Burke talks about a trained incapacity, he talks about learning how to do something so well it makes you incapable of doing other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you never want, as a researcher, to become so good at framing a problem within a narrow disciplinary lens that you aren't capable of seeing other frames and problems, right?
Right.
One of the projects I've been working on, we're talking about non-emergency medical transportation. And, within the first 3 weeks of meeting with my community partners, I realized that one of the problems with how we were framing it wasn't just me, but I'm the communication person. I should have maybe been more sensitive to it. I kept talking about it as the difficulty of getting to the doctor. And especially if you're an older person in a rural community, how difficult it is to drive an hour and a half each way just to get to your standard family doctor appointment.
Right.
And at one point, one of the folks I was talking to said, interestingly, my podiatrist will drive to the assisted living complex, check out the community room, and see 15 people in one day. Why is my podiatrist the only doctor who will come into the community to do that? There are interesting questions and answers about why podiatrists are capable of doing that and other doctors might not be. I wasn't really interested in understanding podiatry better at that moment. I was interested in understanding how problematic it was that I only described the problem as the difficulty of getting from the rural community to the doctor, and not understanding why more health services weren't findable within rural communities, right?
Right.
And as a rhetorician, I should have known, that there were some trained incapacities going on, which only allowed me to see the problem as if the institution were fixed and the patients needed to move to the institution, rather than the institution was capable of change. So do not let yourself become so well trained in framing problems one way that you don't see them another way, would be the first bit of advice I would offer. But then the second bit of advice I would offer is really sharpen those listening skills, right?
Yeah.
Because I would never have got that insight if I hadn't driven to towns of 600 to talk to people about what their lived experiences were. And I would not have got that way if I had driven to those communities and still only listened, for example, with the time or action orientation, which was all about what was next for me and how I could step in. I needed to listen and soak and marinate in their insights and to listen with enough respect that they could trust me enough to tell me all the things that were really going on. The number one skill any communication scholar, rhetorician or otherwise, can develop, I think, is effective listening.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that answer. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me for a little bit today about your amazing work. I find it to be so insightful, and I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate you, and I appreciate everything you're doing for our discipline by maintaining this podcast. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, David.
And that's my conversation with Dr. David Beard. One of the ideas from this conversation that I keep coming back to is that communication doesn't simply help us explain solutions. It helps us determine what the problem is in the first place. Whether we're talking about healthcare, transportation, environmental challenges, or problems within our own workplaces and communities, the way we frame an issue influences what people notice, whose experiences matter, what solutions seem possible, and ultimately whether people are willing to act. And I think that's an important reminder of just how practical rhetoric can be. Communication isn't something that happens after the important work is done. Very often, communication is part of the work. Thank you again to Dr. Beard for joining me, and thank you for listening to Cultivate Talk. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Until then, keep cultivating conversations that matter.